3 days after somebody built a fence on my property, the president of our HOA looked me straight in the eye and told me, if I were you, I'd stop measuring and start accepting reality. The funny thing is, 6 weeks later, he was standing in the street watching that same fence get ripped out of the ground one post at a time. And reality suddenly looked very different. Back in 2021, I lived in a neighborhood outside Raleigh, North Carolina, a place called Maple Creek. Nothing fancy, just one of those quiet suburban communities where everybody waved, everybody mowed their lawn on Saturday morning, and everybody pretended HOA meetings weren't secretly more dramatic than reality TV. My wife, Lauren, and I had bought our house a couple years earlier. We weren't the loud neighbors. We weren't the difficult neighbors. Honestly, we mostly kept to ourselves. I worked from home, spent way too much time trying to grow tomatoes that never seemed impressed by my effort, and generally enjoyed the kind of boring routine that starts sounding pretty great once you hit your 40s. Which is why that Tuesday afternoon felt so surreal. I pulled into my driveway after running errands, grabbed a bag of groceries, and walked through the side gate toward the backyard. At first I thought something looked different, but my brain couldn't immediately process what I was seeing. Then I stopped. There was a fence. A brand new privacy fence. 6 feet tall, running across part of my backyard. Not near my backyard. Not beside it. In it. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was losing my mind. I stood there holding a bag of oranges, staring at fresh lumber, like maybe the answer would reveal itself if I looked long enough. The posts were brand new, the concrete still looked fresh, and the wood had that sharp treated lumber smell. The fence cut through the corner of a garden bed Lauren had spent months building. It clipped part of our irrigation line, and the farther I followed it with my eyes, the worse the situation became, because I knew exactly where my property line was supposed to be. Not approximately. Exactly. When we bought the house, I paid extra for a full professional survey. My friends teased me about it at the time. One of them actually said, "What are you planning to do? Invade another country?" Maybe. You never know. But I'd heard enough stories about neighborhood disputes to know that clear boundaries save headaches later. So I walked over to the rear corner of the lot. And there it was. The survey marker. Exactly where it should be. The fence wasn't on the property line. It wasn't touching it. It was inside it. A good 14 inches. Now 14 inches doesn't sound like much. Most people hear that number and shrug. But stretch 14 inches across nearly 80 feet of property, and suddenly it becomes a whole different conversation. I remember standing there feeling that strange combination of confusion and irritation. Not rage. Not yet. Just disbelief. Like surely there had to be an explanation. Some misunderstanding. Some mistake. Because nobody would intentionally build a permanent structure on someone else's land. Right? That's when I called the HOA president, a guy named Randall Pierce. Randall had been on the board forever. Mid-50s, always dressed like he was about to campaign for mayor, the kind of man who treated every casual conversation like a board meeting. When he answered, I kept my voice calm. "Hey Randall, quick question. There's a new fence behind my house, and I think it's on my property." There was a pause. Then he laughed. Not a friendly laugh. The kind of laugh people use when they've already decided you're wrong. And in that moment, without realizing it, Randall set off a chain of events that would eventually cost the entire neighborhood thousands of dollars. I should have recognized that laugh for what it was. It wasn't confidence. It was certainty. And certainty can be a dangerous thing when it's attached to the wrong person. "Randall, I have a survey," I told him. "Our contractor measured everything." He replied immediately. "The fence is exactly where it's supposed to be." I glanced out the kitchen window at the fence, then back at the paperwork sitting on my counter. "Well, one of those measurements is wrong." Another pause. Then his voice changed. Not louder, just colder. "David, sometimes homeowners misunderstand where their property lines actually are." I remember staring at the phone for a second. Homeowners. Not me. Homeowners. Like I was suddenly some random guy wandering through the conversation. I laughed a little. Not because it was funny, because the alternative was getting angry. "Randall, the survey marker is literally in my yard. You should let the board handle board matters." And then he hung up. Just like that. No discussion. No questions. No offer to double check. Conversation over. That night Lauren found me, sitting on the patio, staring at the fence. "You've been looking at that thing for an hour." 45 minutes. That's somehow worse. I laughed. She didn't. My wife has a gift for spotting problems before I do. Something feels off about this. It does. They wouldn't just build a fence on somebody else's property. That's what worries me. She nodded. Because if it was a mistake, fixing it would be easy. Mistakes get corrected. Decisions are different. The next morning, I started digging. I pulled out our closing documents, reviewed the survey, checked county records, measured distances from the survey pins, then measured them again. Every number led to the same conclusion. The fence was wrong. Not close. Wrong. So I sent an email. Professional. Polite. No accusations. Just facts. Attached survey. Attached photos. Requested review. Asked whether the board would consider an independent survey. Simple. Reasonable. 3 days passed. Nothing. A week passed. Nothing. Then something strange happened. One Saturday morning, I was mowing the lawn when my neighbor across the street, a retired teacher named Carol Simmons, waved me over. Carol knew everything that happened in Maple Creek. Not because she was nosy, because information somehow found her. David, she said quietly, you fighting with the HOA? Apparently. She looked around before speaking. That alone caught my attention. You didn't hear this from me. Those are usually the words that guarantee you're about to hear exactly what you're not supposed to hear. Carol lowered her voice. That fence project was discussed weeks ago. I stopped walking. What fence project? The Western Boundary Project. The what? They wanted the neighborhood to look more uniform. I felt my stomach tighten. Nobody had mentioned any project. Nobody had sent notices. Nobody had asked for homeowner input. Nothing. Carol continued. Randall's been pushing it hard for months. What? She shrugged. Property values. Appearance. Security. Depends on which version of the story you're hearing. That conversation bothered me more than the fence itself, because suddenly the pieces started fitting together. This wasn't a construction mistake. This wasn't some contractor misreading a map. This had been planned, discussed, approved, executed. The only thing they forgot to do was tell the people affected by it. The following week, I attended my first HOA board meeting in years. Not because I enjoyed HOA meetings. Nobody enjoyed HOA meeting. They have all the excitement of airport carpeting. But I wanted answers. The room was packed with maybe 20 homeowners. Coffee cups, folded arms, 4 smiles. The usual. Randall sat at the front table beside several board members. When public comments opened, I stood up. My name is David Carter, Lot 42. The room got quiet. Everyone already knew why I was there. I've requested clarification regarding the new Western Boundary fence. Randall immediately leaned toward his microphone. The matter has already been addressed. Actually, it hadn't. Not once. Not ever. I looked at him. No, it hasn't. A few people shifted in their chairs. One board member suddenly became fascinated by our notes. Another stared at the ceiling. I continued. I have a licensed survey showing the fence crosses on a private property. Randall smiled. It was the kind of smile people wear when they're trying very hard not to show irritation. Our contractor's measurements disagree. Can homeowners see those measurements? Silence. Not long. Just long enough. Then Randall adjusted his papers. They're internal documents. The room reacted instantly. Tiny reactions. Raised eyebrows. People exchanging glances. Because everyone knew that answer made no sense. Even Randall seemed to realize at the moment he said it. I remember feeling something shift inside me right then. Up until that meeting, I'd been operating under the assumption that eventually somebody would step in and correct the mistake. A reasonable person. A board member. Someone. But sitting there, watching grown adults avoid eye contact while pretending everything was normal, I realized something important. Nobody was coming. The system wasn't going to fix itself. And the moment that realization landed, my entire approach changed. I stopped trying to persuade them. I stopped trying to convince them. I stopped looking for cooperation. Instead, I started looking for proof. A week later, I hired one of the most respected surveyors in Wake County. Not a friend. Not a recommendation from Facebook. A professional whose reports routinely ended up in court. When he arrived, he spent nearly 4 hours examining the property. Tripods, GPS equipment, reference markers, the works. He barely spoke the entire time. Just measured, recorded, verified. Before leaving, he finally looked at me. You want my honest opinion? Please. He pointed directly at the fence. That thing shouldn't be there. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Because deep down, part of me had still been wondering whether I was missing something. Whether somehow I had become the crazy neighbor. Turns out I wasn't. And 3 days later, when the final report landed in my inbox, everything changed. Because the survey didn't just confirm the encroachment. It confirmed something much worse. Something that explained why Randall had been so desperate to avoid another measurement in the first place. The report showed the fence wasn't just crossing onto my property. It was crossing onto multiple properties. Not by much. A few inches here, a foot there, 14 inches on my lot. But enough to create a serious legal problem for the HOA. The entire western boundary project had been laid out using an incorrect reference point. One bad measurement at the beginning had pushed everything off course. And the worst part? The mistake would have been obvious if anybody had ordered a proper survey before construction, which meant one of two things had happened. Either nobody checked, or somebody checked and ignored the result. Neither option looked good. I sent the report to the board that same afternoon. Attached every page. Highlighted the findings. Included a formal request for correction. Then I waited. 5 days later, Randall finally responded. One sentence. We disagree with the conclusions. That was it. No explanation. No evidence. No counter-survey. Just disagreement. I actually laughed when I read it. Lauren looked up from the couch. What? I handed her my phone. She read the email, then looked at me. That's their entire response. Apparently. She handed the phone back. Well, that's going to be expensive. Turns out she was right. Very expensive. After speaking with an attorney, we sent a formal notice demanding correction within 21 days. Not because 21 days had magical legal significance. Because it was reasonable. Fair. Enough time to solve the problem without escalating it. If they acted, great. If they didn't, we'd move forward. Day 1 passed. Nothing. Day 7. Nothing. Day 14. Nothing. By day 21, I wasn't even checking my email anymore. I already knew the answer. The deadline had never really been for me. It was for them. An opportunity. One last exit ramp before the cliff. And they drove straight past it. The following week, my attorney filed the necessary action. We submitted everything. Surveys, photos, emails, meeting records, property documents, every ignored request, every unanswered question, every piece of evidence. Then something happened that Randall clearly hadn't expected. The facts were too clean. There wasn't much to argue about. No complicate dispute. No conflicting servas. No gray area. Just a fence in the wrong place. Several weeks later, the order came through. Authorized removal. Simple. Direct. Final. I remember sitting in my kitchen, reading it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Then I called a contractor. Not a demolition company. Not some dramatic crew with bulldozers. Just professionals who specialized in precise property work. The first available opening happened to be a Thursday morning. And that Thursday ended up becoming one of the most satisfying mornings of my life. The truck arrived around 9. A compact excavator rolled off the trailer. Nothing huge, just enough machine to do the job properly. I walked outside with a folder containing the court order. The crew reviewed the paperwork, marked the boundary line, started preparing. And that's when I noticed movement down the street. Randall, standing in his driveway, watching, 3 houses away, arms crossed, completely still. For weeks I'd imagined dozens of possible confrontations, arguments, threats, yelling. None of them happened. Instead, there was only silence. The excavator started with a low rumble. The operator positioned the bucket around the first fence post. Lifted carefully. The ground cracked. The concrete footing loosened. And then, slowly, that first post rose out of the earth. I'll never forget that moment. Because the sound wasn't dramatic. There was no movie soundtrack. No cheering crowd. Just a creaking and dirt falling away. But somehow it felt bigger than that. For nearly 2 months, that fence had represented something far beyond lumber and concrete. It represented arrogance, assumptions, the belief that nobody would challenge a bad decision. And now, inch by inch, it was disappearing. The crew worked methodically. One section, then another, then another. No ruse, no hesitation, just steady progress. Every post removed felt like another chapter closing. I glanced down the street a few times. Randall never moved. Never approached. Never said a word. The same man who had dismissed me. The same man who had laughed. The same man who had told me to accept reality. Now stood silently watching reality get loaded into a trailer. 43 minutes. That's how long it took. 43 minutes to erase a problem that should have been fixed on day one. When the final section came down, the property line was visible again. Open, clear, exactly where it had always been. The strange thing wasn't the victory. It was the quiet. No celebration, no speeches, no dramatic ending. Just a neighborhood returning to normal. Or at least trying to, because the consequences were only beginning. The HOA had to commission new surveys for the entire western boundary. At their expense, they had to revise plans, apply for permits again, relocate sections of fencing, and reimburse legal and survey costs. When everything was finished, the total exceeded $8,000, paid from HOA funds, which meant every homeowner ended up sharing the cost of a mistake most of them never knew existed. That created some uncomfortable conversations. A few board members quietly resigned within the next year. Randall remained, but his reputation didn't. People started asking questions, the kind of questions that should have been asked from the beginning. As for us, life eventually returned to normal. The tomatoes still struggled. The lawn still grew too fast. And every now and then I'd see Randall during evening walks. Neither of us ever spoke. Not once. And honestly, I think that silence says everything. Because looking back, this story was never really about 14 inches of land. It wasn't about a fence. It wasn't even about an HOA. It was about what happens when people become so convinced they're right that they stop checking whether they actually are. One simple conversation could have solved everything. One survey, one honest review, one admission of a mistake. That's all it would have taken. Instead, pride got involved. And pride is expensive. Now here's the question I've gone back and forth on for years. Should I have pushed as hard as I did? Some neighbors thought absolutely. Others believed I should have let it go and preserved the peace. Maybe they're right. Maybe they aren't. I honestly still don't know. What I do know is that once people start moving boundaries without permission, those boundaries rarely stop moving on their own. So if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have fought it all the way to court? Would you have negotiated longer? Or would you have decided 14 inches of dirt simply wasn't worth a fight? Let me know in the comments, because even now, years later, people in Maple Creek still can't agree on who was truly right. And something tells me this audience won't either.